Hey there, welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabriele Nicolet. I am a toddler whisperer, a speech therapist, a parent coach, and today I am joined by Daniela Feldhausen. Daniela, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here.
We are going to talk all about reading, but before we do that, tell the good people a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So Daniela Feldhausen, I'm the founder of Kids Up Reading Coaches. We help kids who are struggling with reading and spelling become fluent readers, good spellers, and confident students. About half of our kids have formally been diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia, and the other half haven't. The other half tend to be referrals from other families. Moms talking on the playground about or on the soccer field. So we have a lot of students who have been diagnosed and a lot of students who haven't been diagnosed with anything, but the common theme is that everyone's having a hard time with reading and spelling.
And this is maybe backing it up a little bit, but how do families come to, what am I trying to ask you? Here's what I'm trying to ask you. It's really something I want to tell the people. When your child, who is 6 or 7 or 8, doesn't like to read, this is a sign that something is difficult, challenging, maybe in air quotes, gone wrong. Maybe there's a dyslexia, maybe there isn't. But can you walk us through, when parents call you, what are they complaining about if they're not diagnosed?
Yeah, so it's usually a question about, well, my child hates reading, like you just said, or there's some test scores at school that aren't looking very good, or sometimes it's a question about reading comprehension. Sometimes parents reach out, the child's reading pretty well, but their spelling is atrocious. And parents will actually literally use that word, like her spelling is atrocious. So there are a couple different signs. Parents sometimes also talk about, flipped letters, so B's and D's and P's and Q's. So that comes up a fair amount. But those are some of the signs. I mean, generally, if your child is really hating reading and telling you that they don't want to do it, there's a good chance that it's really hard for them.
Yeah,
Nobody likes to do things that are really hard.
yeah.
And if reading is really hard, rather than say to you, reading's really hard, they might be saying to you, I hate reading.
There you
So
go.
that's always a good sign that at least it's worth investigating a little bit further as to what might be going on here.
Yeah. And that brings us to, okay, so parents call somebody like you, or they call somebody who specializes in reading. Tell us about what are the important things to know about reading instruction? Because there is a lot of it's not even misinformation, it's just terrible information about we know a lot about how kids learn to read, and
Absolutely.
yet many teachers do not appear to know this information. So set the record straight
Yes.
for us, please.
So there's a whole history here. There's a reason why. So back when I was a kid, and I'm sort of late 50s at this point, back when I was a kid, students were taught to read using phonics. Phonics is the sound, we call it the phoneme grapheme correspondences, but the correspondences between the sounds and the letters. After that, our country and I think all of the English-speaking countries actually moved away from teaching kids phonics, and started using a different system, sometimes called balanced literacy, 3 cueing system. It's got a whole bunch of different names. But the idea was, well, it's too boring. These poor kids, they don't want to learn phonics. That's no fun. Let's have them look at, cues. Let's have them think about what makes sense in this sentence, or look at the picture and what kind of word would fit in that sentence. So they're looking at all kinds of other cues, but not necessarily looking at the actual letters in the word and sounding those letters out one by one. And all the research for more than 20 years now has said you have to teach kids those correspondences between the sounds and the letters.
Yeah.
And you also need to make sure they understand how our reading and writing system works. And that piece is sometimes called phonological skills, or phonological awareness, or phonemic awareness. There are a bunch of different names for it, but it basically means, does the student, or the adult for that matter, realize that words are made up of individual sounds? You can put them together in different combinations and get different words.
So now
Yes.
is a really good time for you to flip
Okay.
your camera on And
Okay.
if you're listening to this on a podcast player, I encourage you to go over to YouTube when you have a chance, because Daniela's going to do a cool demonstration here, and I'll talk you through. I'll talk it through while you set up. But basically, what Daniela is talking about is this notion that you can manipulate individual sounds. And one of the things that your program that you work with, but also good reading programs do, is make this very explicit. And so for those of you who aren't watching, Daniela's got 3 stacks of cards. They all have a letter on them. The middle one has a vowel. And so go ahead.
Okay, so this is what's known as the Orton-Gillingham blending board. So Orton-Gillingham is a very good and a very popular way of teaching kids those correspondences between the sounds and the letters. And this is a way to get some really good targeted practice in with whatever phonics pattern you're teaching that student that day. So right now we've got 3 stacks of cards. The first one, here, let's actually switch this over. The first one has a V, the second one has an I, and the third one has an X for those who can't see it. So if we wanted a student to read this word, we would start on the left and we would go Vix. Then we would do it again and we would have them do it, and we're doing it faster and faster until eventually they can say Vix.
Yep.
And if what we're targeting today is that short I sound, then we can swap out the cards in the first pile. So we're going to get rid of that V. And we're going to put something else. The QU just happened to pop up. So this would now be Quicks. And then the next one that pops up is Licks, and then Nicks, and then Six, and then Ricks, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
People are gonna say, but Rix, R-I-X, is not a word. What
That's
do you
right.
say?
That is a nonsense word, and that is wonderful. This is the best way to make sure the children have learned those correspondences between the sounds and the letters. Because it's one thing to be able to memorize a bunch of words, and a lot of the kids we work with, especially the ones who don't get diagnosed until they're a little bit older, they tend to have memorized a bunch of words, and you can't really be sure that they've learned those phonics patterns unless you are asking them to do it with nonsense words. So this is really good way of getting in that practice with nonsense words to really check to see whether they can read those different phonics patterns that are on the blending board.
And Daniela, why is it bad if kids have memorized a bunch of words?
It's not bad per se. It's just that that's not how you want to learn to read. It's not possible to memorize the thousands and thousands of words that we have in the English language. I mean, I guess there might be a few people out there who can do it. For the vast majority of us, that's not an option. I can't sit here and memorize 4,000 words. What I can do is memorize those sound letter correspondences and then sound a word out left to right. And if I understand how our reading and writing system works, and if I take that word and I sound it out multiple times, and I associate this letter with this sound and this letter with this sound, and I string it together, and then I also know what that word means, then my brain goes through this process called creating a mental orthographic image. So you're basically mapping that word. And after that, you can just read it automatically. Like sometimes you need to sound it out, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. For some kids, they might need to sound it out 10 times or 20 times. But eventually, with enough repetition, they'll have sounded it out enough times that that mapping has taken place, and then they can just read it without thinking about it. Like imagine you're driving down the street and you see a billboard. You can't stop yourself from reading it. Your brain just automatically knows what those words are on that billboard.
But I think what we do with kids, particularly when we exclusively focus on sight words, is we're circumventing that whole foundational process. And the chunks are too big. So we're using we're skipping ahead, number one. We're overloading a type of memory in the brain of, sort of a pictographic memory, not an orthographic memory. And then expecting kids to retrieve on that carousel instead of having a really solid foundation for what the chunks are.
Exactly.
And we know that the best way to store information is in bite-sized chunks where you can call it up automatically, very easily, rearrange the pieces, and go ahead. And because, as you say, like vocabulary is is vast, is infinite even. There's constantly new words coming out. Had a whole conversation about skibbity toilet the other day. How do you spell that? Thank you very much. But so it is, I just really want to reinforce this idea here. If we are not addressing phonemic skills, phonological skills, phonics, we have missed the reading train.
That's right. You need to understand how the system works, and you need to know those phonics patterns. Memorizing words is not a good plan. And in fact, one of the things that we need to do for a lot of the kids who we're working with is we need to get them out of the habit of trying to memorize words. Because the kids who are memorizing the words are the ones who look at the first two letters in the word, and then they just kind of guess the rest of the word. And that's not going to get you very far. So we always have to say to them, you know what? Well, hold on. Read every single one of those letters. You can't skip any of those letters. Read every single one of those letters. And if they do that, then they'll get the word right. But if they just look at the first two letters and guess, then, very often that doesn't work out for them.
And what's the average age of kids who come to you?
We work with, I'm going to say most of the kids we work with are in elementary school. But we also have a fair number of kids in middle school and in high school. There are plenty of kids who get diagnosed with dyslexia in 10th grade and 11th grade and so on. We've occasionally worked with some 4-year-olds. We have, younger siblings who are in kindergarten. We have the occasional college student, but the vast majority of our students are between, I'm going to say, 1st grade and 4th grade or 5th grade or something like that.
And obviously the way you interface, interact with a student of various ages is going to change, but does the program change at all? How does that work?
Yeah, so what we do is I'll talk to the student up front. So I'll do what are called screeners, and I'll check their phonological skills and I check their phonics skills. The whole process, including the conversation with the parents, takes about an hour. And in fact, I want the parents in the background watching as I'm doing the screeners with the student so that they can see and hear for themselves what's easy for their student and what's hard for them. And that then, once I've done the screeners, then I know, okay, these are the skills the student has mastered, and these are the skills the student needs to learn. And then we're only going to teach them the skills that they need to learn. This is not some, one size fits all program and you start with box number 1 and you march your way through all these different levels. No, it's actually what does this particular student need? And that's exactly what we're going to teach them. And that might mean that an 11th grader who's coming in needs to go learn those short vowel sounds because for whatever reason, they missed that in kindergarten and 1st grade. So we've absolutely taken 11th graders and started them off with some kindergarten, 1st grade skills that they were missing. Yeah. You need to have a really strong foundation. You want to make sure you've got those early skills, those kindergarten and 1st grade skills. Once those are done, then you work on the 2nd grade skills. And once they've got those 2nd grade skills, then you work on the 3rd grade skills. And we do a lot of progress monitoring along the way. So we'll go back and we'll do another phonics screener. We'll do a spelling screener with the student. Spelling is a really good way to know whether children have learned those phonics patterns. Sometimes, or many times, it's easier to read a word with a particular phonics pattern than it is to spell a word without phonics pattern. It's like when you're speaking or learning a foreign language. It's easier to understand it than it is to actually produce it yourself. And so we'll have kids, we'll do a spelling screener with them that goes through and systematically checks all the different phonics patterns that we've taught them to make sure that they actually know those patterns well enough, not just to be able to read them, but also to be able to spell words with those.
Before we got on camera, we were sort of talking. I said, what do people need to know that they don't know? And you said dyslexia is not, I don't know if you said a death sentence, but you said dyslexia is not basically it's not a big deal. It's not a lifelong, doesn't have to be a lifelong thing. Yeah, tell us about when kids are diagnosed with dyslexia, walk us through what happens. How do we work with them? How do they do?
Sure. So they'll come to us. We have a lot of psychologists who refer students to us. And like I said, we'll start off, we'll do the screeners. We'll figure out what skills they've got, what skills they're missing. And then we'll teach them those skills that they're missing. And the vast majority of students who leave our program, we call it graduate from our program, get caught up to grade level. They get caught up to their peers. And from that point forward, their teacher in school can teach them the rest of those phonics patterns that they're missing. That, of course, assumes that the teacher in school is teaching them the phonics patterns. So that's not true in all schools and in all situations. But if your student comes to us, let's say in the middle of second grade, or let's say the beginning of second grade, and we get them caught up to their peers by the middle of second grade, then their second grade teacher can teach them the rest of those second grade phonics patterns, and the third grade teacher can teach them the third grade patterns, and so on and so forth. The vast majority of our kids, you would not know years later that they ever had a problem with reading when they were younger.
Yeah.
It's the vast majority. There are exceptions, and I'm not going to pretend that there aren't. We've absolutely worked with students who need more time to get caught up and who maybe won't ever be able to sound words out as quickly or as fluently as you'd like them to. So I'm not promising that our program can solve all problems.
Yeah.
But the vast, vast, vast majority of our kids, by the time they're done, by the time they graduate from us, they're good to go. They're fine.
And are these kids who have, I mean, you hear twice exceptional, you hear ADHD, you hear other diagnoses kind of thrown in, all of these kind of academic / developmental, categories kind of travel together.
Sure.
How does that play?
So I'm going to say probably half the kids we work with have a diagnosis of ADHD, or maybe they would if they were to get tested. There is, like you said, there's a huge overlap between these things. I mean, there's an enormous overlap between kids with dyslexia or kids with reading struggles and spelling struggles and kids with ADHD. That is par for the course for us. We also work with kids who are also on the autism spectrum, kids who've also got, hearing issue, like all kinds of kids with all kinds of different issues.
Yeah.
May also have trouble with reading and spelling, and we work with them on the reading and spelling.
Yeah. And certainly just for all of the people who are listening who have a speech and language kind of history, kids, it is well documented in the literature that kids who have speech and language, early developmental speech and language issues are at risk for reading issues later. So yes, that is a natural progression. Obviously, if we have trouble learning sounds and words and speaking sounds and words early on, reading is a language act. Yeah. And which is a funny thing to think about, because it's really just like fly specks on a piece of paper, and yet because of this sound symbol relationship, it is processed in the language centers of the brain, so that makes it really interesting for people like you and me.
Yeah, there's a huge overlap. I'm going to say the vast majority of our kids, when I start asking the parents, even if you can't hear anything anymore, neither in terms of the pronunciation nor in terms of their ability to express themselves, even if you can't hear anything anymore, sometimes I'll still ask the parents, so is there any history of being in speech therapy? Many, many, many times the families will say, oh yes, she was in speech therapy for years working on all these different things.
Yeah.
Sometimes what I've noticed is that the parent will say, oh yeah, she had a hard time with L's, for example. Pronouncing L's. A child who has a hard time pronouncing L's may later have a hard time with L blends, for example, those L blends that we have at beginnings of words. So there is absolutely some more deep-seated issue with language that is popping up when you're working with the students earlier, and then popping up again when we're working with the students later in terms of reading and spelling.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap.
And so how long are students generally in your program when they come?
Most students somewhere between 4 and 9 months. We do what's called high intensity tutoring, meaning most of the students we work with 3 times a week, sometimes 4 times a week. Over the summer, it's even 5 times a week, not always, but in many cases. Mm-hmm. The idea is that you want to get kids caught up as quickly as possible, in part for self-esteem reasons, for self-confidence reasons, right? The sooner they're caught up, the better they feel about themselves, the less likely it is that the reading issue will turn into an issue with math and social studies and, other issues.
And behavior.
And behavior, absolutely, absolutely. So you want to catch it for all of those reasons as quickly as possible, but also for the reason that we were talking about earlier. If we can get them caught up by middle of second grade, then the second grade teacher can teach them the rest of those patterns. Mm-hmm. So it's actually faster, cheaper, easier if you can front load this and do 3, 4, 5 sessions a week, and then graduate them out and let their school and their teacher take over.
You just described the whole philosophy behind early intervention, early childhood education, which is front load, front load, front load. Front load it all.
Yep, absolutely. Having said that, there are a lot of students who can't do it. Like, families just can't always fit it into their schedule. I think the gold standard for dyslexia tutoring is an hour a day, 5 days a week. I don't know many families who can actually pull that off. We do everything on Zoom, which helps a whole lot with the scheduling, because you no longer have to worry about, driving to the center and sitting there while your student is being tutored and then driving back, or having, somebody in your house while you're getting kids ready for school in the mornings or preparing dinner or whatever. So I think the way we structure it helps families with the logistics of being able to squeeze 3 and 4, maybe even 5 sessions per week into their day.
Yeah.
But it is an intensive commitment of, time, money, effort. Like, this is a big deal. The good news is, like I said, the vast majority of our kids, we graduate them out and they're fine and they move on with their lives. So this is not something you're going to be dealing with forever and ever. This is, a process that you need to go through until your child understands how our reading and writing system works, and then learns what they need to learn in order to get caught up to their peers.
Walk me through a little bit more about the older students. I can see super clearly, right? Initial reading difficulties, hopefully as early as first grade. By the way, if you have a first grader who doesn't like to read, there's a reason. Send them to a tutor, get a tutor now.
It'll be a lot faster and cheaper, I promise.
It's so much faster and cheaper than dealing with, I'm just going to draw this straight line for people, right? Which is, I have an issue with reading. I don't like to read. Okay, which means what? I avoid reading tasks. I rant and rave at my parents every time I have to do it. They feel bad. I feel bad. Now, times 365 days, times however many years that goes on, and every time that happens is another notch in my self-confidence, and also, by the way, in my skill set.
You're not getting that practice.
Nobody wins when we wait.
Yeah.
No, not the parents, not the kids, not even the tutors, really, because you're unwinding a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't have had to unwind before.
That's right.
So the question,
sorry, I was going to say, you were asking specifically about the older students.
Yeah.
And I found something super, super interesting. Years ago, I used to think that, it's got to be a whole lot faster and easier to teach a first grader, and second grader is going to take longer, and then a third grader will take longer. And oh my gosh, if you are working with a 10th grader or an 11th grader, that's going to take so much longer to get them caught up. Turns out that is not true. That has not been my experience at all. Those 10th and 11th graders, or even the middle schoolers, they tend to get caught up more quickly than somebody who was diagnosed in first or second grade. And so I've thought a lot about it. I've talked to various testing psychologists about it. I think what's going on, and nobody knows, like none of the people I've talked to, nobody's ever seen a research study on this. But what we think is going on is that if your student doesn't get diagnosed until 10th grade or 11th grade, they've skirted through the system all this time. They've got a lot of other strengths, a lot of other skills that are really supporting them.
Sure.
They might have a good vocabulary. They might have, good memory and processing speed, lots of background knowledge. All these other things that go into making a good reader. They're still going to have all those skills as they're then learning those skills that they're missing, the phonological skills and the phonics skills. And so all of that is going to support them as they're learning these new skills. And so the 10th and 11th graders tend to get caught up more quickly than the kids where, everyone can tell in first grade that we've got a problem here.
Yeah. So interesting. I love that.
Yeah. I was not expecting that years ago.
Well, and, really interesting. I love that. Okay. We're going to I would like to talk a little bit about decoding, which is what we've been talking about this whole time, right? In other words, what do we see? What do we understand about these little letters that we see on the paper or on the screen versus comprehension?
Okay.
Tell me about how you work with, we've heard about the decoding. Do you work with comprehension? How so? Or not?
So a lot of families come to us and say, the school test scores show that my student is having trouble with reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is considered a product of your ability to get the words off the page, what we're calling decoding, or to sound the words out, to be able to read those words on the page. And the other side of that equation is your facility with language. So you need to be able to get the words off the page. You need to be able to literally read the words on the page. And then you also need to know what those words mean. Those are the two factors that really go into reading comprehension. We work on the first piece. We work on getting those words off the page. If a student has trouble in the other area, if the student has trouble with language, then we'll send them to a speech language pathologist, or a speech language therapist. For most of the kids we work with, solving the decoding problem, so working on the reading and spelling, getting the words off the page and on the back on the page, solves the reading comprehension issue, because that's where the weakness was. There are kids who only have a language issue, and there are kids who have a reading issue and a language issue. So every once in a while we get into a conversation about, okay, so this particular student might have both of these issues. And then you have to have a conversation about, okay, which do you want to tackle first? Given that all these things should be done fairly high intensity, it's really hard to do this all at the same time. So you're going to then have a conversation about sequencing. Should you work on the language first, or should you work on the reading and spelling first?
You should work on the reading first.
Why are you saying that?
Well, I'm saying that as a speech language pathologist because after you have a base level of vocabulary, and you wouldn't teach decoding of vocabulary that you're unfamiliar with, but I think it would be wise to teach the patterns of the vocabulary that you will eventually be familiar with. That's my personal preference, but probably you've had both ways. You tell me.
Well, I've talked to other speech language pathologists who've said, no. If there's a reading problem and a language problem, families should tackle the language problem, because that's more important, because, speaking and communicating with others is more, if you have to choose, speaking and understanding is more important than reading and spelling.
Fair. I was assuming a base level of communication as well, of verbal communication. Yes. And so for kids who are not yet operating at a level of satisfactory communication for them, that's 100% correct. You're right. I was I was assuming a level of operation that was sufficient to address the reading. But
so we sometimes get, and I talk to parents about this in the sort of introductory call that we do. A lot of times if they come to me and asking about reading comprehension, I'll ask things like, well, you say your student can't read this, a particular passage and answer questions about it. What if you took away the reading piece of it? What if you read it to them? If you read the passage to them, could they understand it? And could they answer questions about it in a way that other people can understand? And if the answer to that is, well, sometimes it's really hard to understand. Sometimes it's really hard to follow, what he's saying, or sometimes I'm not sure if he really understands what I'm saying. Then I'll generally say to them, you know what, you might want to talk to a speech language pathologist first and work on the language issues first, and then come back to me and we'll talk about the reading and spelling and work on those once the language issues have been worked on.
Yep, absolutely. And there are speech language pathologists, just so people know, who focus on reading, both aspects of reading, as well as language development, obviously. But that is it's kind of an additional training, and it's a specialized focus. So it's not all speech language pathologists. We're all basically trained, but we are not specialists necessarily in reading. We are language specialists.
Yeah, I was surprised by that when I, got into this field. For some reason, I thought that all speech language pathologists were specialists in reading and spelling as well. And it turns out, no, they're not. That's not generally a part of the training. You can get that training, but it's separate and apart from the general training as a speech language pathologist.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's still the case, but there was also kind of a dust up among professions between reading specialists and speech language pathologists, particularly in schools, like who's going to do what. That is a bunch of inside baseball that I certainly don't need to get involved in. But yeah, when you have overlapping professions that way, it can get, you have to do your research on who knows what.
Yeah, you have to do your research, and then you have to figure out availability. I mean, it can be hard to find a good tutor for somebody with dyslexia to teach the reading and spelling. It can, from what I hear, be even harder to find a good speech language pathologist, and to find a speech language pathologist who can do the reading tutoring 3, 4, 5 times a week. I think that's a pretty tall order.
That's near impossible. There are practices who do specialize in that, but I've
Yeah.
almost never heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are skill. It's not rocket science, but there is a lot that goes into these professions. In order to be a good reading and spelling instructor, and I know this is also true of SLPs, you need to know a lot about our language, the origins of our language, how it works, the different languages that these, different words came from, how we build these things together, the sounds in different parts of like there's so much there. And there aren't that many people who are trained in all of this. There aren't nearly enough of us to go around.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big reasons why there's so many kids right now who are having such a hard time with reading. The colleges, the teacher prep colleges have not done a good job of teaching teachers how to teach kids to read. So there are many, many kids who aren't learning it in school. And then you need to find somebody outside of school, assuming you can even, have the means to do that. It's not easy.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
And so, yeah, listen, if your child is in a school where they're not using a phonics-based approach, you should ask about that. It's called the science of reading. If you want to Google something, Google the science of reading. Daniela Feldhausen, if people want to learn more about Kids Up reading coaches, is that what it's called?
Yep, you got it right. You got it right. I know it's a long name. Kids Up Reading Coaches. They can go to our website, kidsupreadingcoaches.com. And there's a little button on there that says schedule a call with Daniela. You can click on that little button and you'll see the availability on my calendar and you can book yourself an appointment and I would be happy to talk to you. Or if you prefer to do it by email, you can just fill out the little contact us form and we'll get back to you right away.
Fantastic. Daniela, thank you for being here to educate us about reading.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
This was fun.
It was fun. Okay, you have a great day. Bye.